A classical language is a language with a literature that is classical. According to UC Berkeley linguist George L. Hart, it should be ancient, it should be an independent tradition that arose mostly on its own, not as an offshoot of another tradition, and it must have a large and extremely rich body of ancient literature. Thus classical languages tend to either be dead languages, or show a high degree of diglossia, as the spoken varieties of the language diverge further and further away from the classical written language over centuries. Classical studies. In the context of traditional European classical studies, the classical languages refer to ancient Greek and Latin, which were the literary languages of the Mediterranean world in classical antiquity. In terms of worldwide cultural importance, Edward Sapir in language would extend the list to include Chinese, Arabic, and Sanskrit. When we realize that an educated Japanese can hardly frame a single literary sentence without the use of Chinese resources, that to this day Siamese and Burmese and Cambodian bear the unmistakable imprint of the Sanskrit and Pali that came in with Hindu Buddhism centuries ago, or that whether we argue for or against the teaching of Latin and Greek, in schools our argument is sure to be studied with words that have come to us from Rome and Athens, we get some indication of what early Chinese culture, Buddhism, and classical Mediterranean civilization have meant in the world's history. There are just 5 languages that have had an overwhelming significance as carriers of culture. They are Classical Chinese, Sanskrit, Arabic, Greek, and Latin. In comparison with these, even such culturally important languages as Hebrew and French sink into a secondary position. In this sense, a classical language is a language that has a broad influence over an extended period of time, even after it is no longer a colloquial mother tongue in its original form. If one language uses roots from another language to coin words, this is an indication that the second language is a classical language. Living languages with a large sphere of influence are known as world languages. General usage: the following languages are generally taken to have a classical stage. Such a stage is limited in time and is considered classical if it comes to be regarded as a literary golden age retrospectively. Thus, Classical Greek is the language of 5th to 4th century BC Athens and, as such, only a small subset of the varieties of the Greek language as a whole. A classical period usually corresponds to a flowering of literature following an archaic period, such as Classical Latin succeeding Old Latin, Classical Sumerian succeeding Archaic Sumerian, Classical Sanskrit succeeding Vedic Sanskrit, Classical Persian succeeding Old Persian. This is partly a matter of terminology, and for example Old Chinese is taken to include rather than precede Classical Chinese. In some cases, such as those of Arabic and Tamil, the classical stage corresponds to the earliest attested literary variant. Antiquity: Classical Sumerian, Middle Egyptian, Old Babylonian, Middle Assyrian, Classical Hebrew, Classical Aramaic, Classical Chinese, Classical Greek, Classical Sanskrit, Classical Tamil, Classical Pali, Classical Latin, Classical Mandaic, Classical Syriac, Middle Persian, Classical Coptic, Middle Ages, Classical Armenian, Classical Arabic, Old Saxon, Old Norse, Old Nubian, Classical Tibetan, Classical Kannada, Old Javanese, Old English, Old Bulgarian, Classical Georgian, Old East Slavic, and Korean Old Khmer, New Persian, Classical Japanese, Classical Occitan, Classical Tagalog, Middle High German, Old Serbian, Classical Telugu, Malayalam language, Middle Bulgarian, Middle Low German, Classical Icelandic, Classical Catalan, Classical Manding, Old Ruthenian, Old Anatolian Turkish, Classical Ge'ez, Classical Irish, or Classical Gaelic, Classical Wolof, Middle English, Classical Hungarian, Classical Songhai, Early New High German, Classical Malay, Middle Arya, Chagatai, Pre-colonial Americas, Classical Maya, Classical Quechua, Classical Nahuatl, Classical Kiche, Classical Tupi, Classical Mapuk, Early Modern Period, Renaissance Italian, Late Old Portuguese, Early Modern Spanish, Classical Azeri, Classical Danish, Old Lithuanian, Early Modern English, Middle Polish, Classical Ottoman Turkish, Manchu language, Early Modern Dutch, Early Modern French, Classical Ladino, Classical Russian, Classical Mongolian language, Classical Yiddish. See also, Oriation, An aspect of the influence of a classical language on a later language. Classical languages of India, classics, classicism, golden age, lingua franca, list of lingua francas, literary language, sacred language, official language, standard language, world language, list of languages by first written accounts, references. Flood, Gavin, An Introduction to Hinduism, Cambridge University Press, ISBN A0-521-43878-0A.